The day my sister stood in front of 30 people and laughed, while I was on the floor, that was the day I stopped being the version of myself that let things go. I had just tripped on the step at the edge of the outdoor patio at my parents' anniversary party. My ankle twisted. The pain was sharp and immediate. I sat on the ground for a few seconds, trying to breathe through it, and I looked up and saw my sister Renee standing not 10 feet away. She was not moving toward me. She was not asking if I was okay. She was laughing. She covered her mouth with one hand and leaned into her husband's arm and laughed like it was the funniest thing she had seen all year. No one helped me up for almost a full minute. The people who finally came were my parents' neighbors, not my mother, not my father, not Renee. The neighbors. I sat with that image for the rest of the party and all the way home and all through the next morning. And then I started thinking about everything else. The promotion Renee had gotten at the company where I was a silent investor. The salary she was drawing from a department I had funded. The car she drove to that party was leased through a business account I had personally approved 2 years earlier. And she laughed while I sat on the ground in pain. I did not say a word that night. I did not send an angry text. I did not call my mother and cry about what happened. I just sat with the truth of it. And what came next was not rage. It was something much quieter. It was clarity. Before this story goes further, I want to ask you something real. If the person laughing while you were in pain was also someone whose entire career you were quietly funding, what would you do? Would you confront them and give them a chance to explain? Or would you let their own actions write the ending? Tell me in the comments. Because how you answer that question says everything about how much you have already been through. My name is Hazel. I am 38 years old. I have one younger sister named Renee, two parents who always told me I was the responsible one, and a very long history of taking that description as a compliment when I should have been treating it as a warning. I want to tell you everything, but I need you to understand something first. This is not a story about being a victim. I do not think of myself that way, and I never will. This is a story about being a person who gave and gave and gave without ever stopping to read the terms of what she was giving into. And then one day something small happened, a fall, a laugh, 30 seconds of being left on the ground, and something inside me finally got very, very still. And in that stillness, I began to see everything clearly for the first time. I will start at the beginning. Not the very beginning, because that would take too long, and I want you to understand the part that matters. I will start where the roots of the problem go deepest, which is about 12 years ago when I first started building something real. I had been working in financial consulting since I was 23. I was good at it in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, like I could see patterns other people missed and make connections that took other analysts years to develop. By the time I was 26, I had saved enough to make my first small investment. By 28, I had turned that into something significant. I was not wealthy in the way that gets you on any kind of list, but I was quietly, steadily building something solid. And I did it mostly alone. My family knew I was doing well. They knew in the general way families know things. They could see I had a nice apartment. I drove a reliable car. I wore good clothes. I never complained about money. What they did not know, because I did not tell them, was the exact shape of what I had built. I am a private person by nature. I do not perform success. I just live it quietly and keep working. The first time my family came to me with a real request, Hazel was 29. My father had been running a small construction supply business for about 15 years. It was doing okay, but not great. He had an opportunity to expand into a new location, but needed capital he did not have. He came to me. I said yes. I invested a meaningful amount into his business expansion and asked for nothing except that the books stay clean and that I get a modest return over 5 years. My father shook my hand and told me he was proud of me. My mother cried a little. Renee was not there for that conversation. She was 25 at the time and living her life in a way that looked casual and fun from the outside. She was not thinking about business or investment or anything particularly serious, and I did not mind. People find their path at different times. The expansion worked. My father's business grew in a way that genuinely made me happy because I loved my father and wanted good things for him. Over the next 2 years, the business brought on new employees, law, ended a few solid contracts, and established itself in the new location. My return came in steadily and on time. Things felt good. And then Renee decided she wanted a job. She had been doing some event coordinating work on a freelance basis. She was charming and organized in a social way, good with people, good at putting things together visually. My father mentioned she was interested in coming into the business in an administrative and client relations role. He asked what I thought. I said I thought it was a great idea. I thought it would give her stability and give the business a warm face for client relationships. What I did not think hard enough about was what it would mean to have my sister drawing a salary from a company I had a financial stake in. Not because I begrudged her an income, but because I did not think through the dynamic it would create over time. Renee came into the business and she was good at her job. She was genuinely good. She had a way with clients that my father did not, a warmth and a follow-through energy that helped bring in referrals. Within 2 years, she had become a central figure in the day-to-day operations. My father promoted her to Director of Client Relations. Her salary went up significantly. The business continued to grow. And somewhere in that growth, a shift happened that I did not name at the time because I was not paying close enough attention to the non-financial parts of what was happening. The shift was this: Renee started to believe that the business was hers. not in any legal or financial sense, but emotionally, psychologically, in the way she talked about it, in the way she made decisions, in the way she began to treat my father's leadership as optional and her own opinion as final. And my father, who had always found conflict uncomfortable, let it happen. He stepped back. He told himself it was delegation. He told himself he was proud of how she had grown into the role. But what was really happening was that Renee had filled a space and then expanded it until there was no room left for anyone else. And no one told me any of this. Not my father, not my mother, not anyone at the business. I found out the way you find out things that have been hidden from you by accident. I was visiting my parents one Sunday afternoon about 4 years after Renee had joined the business. My father had stepped out to get something from the garage, and my mother was in the kitchen. I was sitting at the dining table, and I noticed a folder of business papers sitting open on the table. I was not snooping. The folder was just there, open, like it had been left mid-read. And a page near the top caught my eye because it had a salary figure on it that I did not recognize. The figure was significantly higher than what I had understood Renee's salary to be. Not a small difference. A large one. I looked at the page more carefully and realized it was a compensation summary for the previous quarter. Renee's salary had been increased 3 times in the past 14 months. Each increase was well within my father's authority to authorize. None of them had been mentioned to me. I closed the folder and said nothing. Not because I was not bothered, but because I wanted to think before I spoke. That is how I have always operated. I do not react before I understand. Over the next few weeks, I quietly pulled together my records and did some math. The returns I had been receiving from my investment were consistent and on time, which was the arrangement. But the growth I would have expected to see reflected in the business's overall profile was not quite matching the numbers I was reviewing. There was no clear fraud, nothing that would jump out on an audit. But there was a softness in the numbers that I could feel in my gut before I could prove it on paper. I hired a financial consultant I trusted, a woman named Diane who I had worked with years earlier, and I asked her to do a quiet review of the business accounts. Nothing invasive, just a health check from an investor's perspective. Diane came back to me 3 weeks later and told me what she had found. There was no fraud, but there were patterns. Renee had been expensing items through the business that were personal in nature. Not egregiously large, but consistent. A lease on a vehicle that was categorized as a company vehicle, but that Renee drove exclusively for personal use. Meals and travel that were logged as client entertainment, but that cross-referencing showed had no corresponding client on record. Subscriptions and services that had no clear business purpose. Individually, each item was defensible. Together, they painted a picture of someone who had decided that the line between her personal finances and the company finances was more of a suggestion than a boundary. I thanked Diane and I sat with that information for a long time. Here is what I want you to understand about what I did not do. I did not call my father and confront him. I not call Renee and accuse her. I did not send an email or a message or demand a meeting. I decided to watch and wait and understand the full picture before I moved. That decision protected me in ways I did not even understand yet. Because what I did not know at that point was that the expensed items were only the first layer. There was a second layer underneath that was going to be far more important. The business had grown enough over the years that my father had been approached by a buyer. A quiet offer. Not a full acquisition, but a partial stake purchase that would have given an outside firm a meaningful ownership position and a seat at the table. My father had not mentioned this to me either. The reason he had not mentioned it was because Renee had told him to handle it without involving me. I found out about the offer not through my family, but through a mutual contact in the industry who mentioned it casually over coffee, assuming I already knew. I did not already know. I sat in that coffee shop after my contact had moved on to other topics, and I felt something settle in my chest like a stone going to the bottom of still water. Not panic, not anger, just the cold, clean arrival of understanding. My family had been managing my investment in a company I had partly built without telling me about offers, salary increases, personal expenses, or any meaningful change in the direction of the business. And they had not done this because they were confused about my role. They had done this because Renee had built a version of the business story in which I was the quiet money in the background, and she was the person who ran things. I needed to know how far back this version of the story went. So I kept watching. It did not take long for the next piece to arrive. It arrived at my parents' 30th wedding anniversary party 3 weeks after the coffee shop conversation. The party was held at a rented outdoor venue. About 35 people attended. Family, old friends of my parents, some colleagues of my father, a few neighbors. I had helped organize it. I had paid for a meaningful portion of it, actually, because my parents had a budget, and I had quietly topped it up without saying so. I just wanted the evening to be beautiful for them. I arrived early to help with setup. Renee arrived late, which was not unusual. She came in on her husband Marcus's arm wearing a dress that probably cost more than what I had paid for the centerpieces. She did not ask if I needed help. She went straight to the bar and then straight to the most visible cluster of people and became the center of that cluster within about 4 minutes. She was very good at that. I watched her from across the room, and I felt something I could not quite name. Not jealousy, Something more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has finally understood that the version of the relationship they believed in was not the version that actually existed. The party moved outside when the sun dropped. There were string lights, a long table, music, the kind of evening my parents deserved. I was carrying 2 glasses of water from the serving table toward where my mother was sitting, and I did not see the slight drop at the edge of the patio. My shoe caught it wrong and I went down, hard and fast and badly. My ankle rolled and I hit the stone edge of the patio floor with my elbow, and I sat there for a moment just absorbing the pain. I looked up. Renee was standing 10 feet away. She had seen me fall. She was laughing. She was covering her mouth and leaning into Marcus and laughing. And Marcus glanced over at me and then back at her, and he smiled too. Not a cruel smile, more an uncomfortable one, but he did not come over. Neither did she. Neither did my parents, who were on the other side of the table and may not have seen immediately. The people who came to help me up were 2 of my parents' neighbors whose names I barely knew. The water I had been carrying was on the ground. My ankle was throbbing. I thanked the neighbors and told them I was fine. I straightened my dress and I walked to my mother's side and I sat down, and I spent the rest of the party being exactly as warm and present as I had planned to be. I did not say a word about what had happened. I smiled. I ate. I toasted my parents. I hugged people goodbye. And I went home and I made a list. Not an emotional list. Not a list of grievances. A practical list. A list of everything I needed to understand and everything I needed to protect. My investment in the business was documented, but the documentation was several years old and had been handled informally in the way family agreements often are. I needed something cleaner. My father's business had grown into something that now had real value, and that value had been grown at least partly by my capital. The expensed personal items were a problem, but they were not the main problem. The main problem was that if my father ever sold or transferred the business, my position as an investor might not be as protected as it should have been given the informal nature of our original agreement. The offer that had been made without my knowledge was still on the table. I knew this from my contact. It had not been accepted, but the fact that it had been seriously considered and that Renee had apparently been managing those conversations meant that a transaction could happen in a way that might reduce or eliminate my return entirely if I did not act. I called an attorney, not my usual counsel for my personal investments, but a corporate attorney I trusted who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Her name was Patricia. I gave her the full picture. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said, "So the person running the day-to-day operations is drawing a salary funded by your investment, expensing personal costs through the business accounts, and has attempted to manage an ownership transfer discussion without your knowledge or participation." I said yes. That is an accurate summary. Patricia said, then we start with documentation. And we did. What most people do not understand about the kind of quiet correction I was about to begin is that it is not dramatic and it is not fast. It is methodical. It is paperwork. It is emails written in measured language. It is meetings with professionals. It is not a confrontation in a parking lot. It is not a speech at a dinner table. It is the slow building of a position that, once complete, is essentially unassailable. The first step was formalizing my investor status. Patricia drafted an updated agreement that reflected the actual state of my investment, the original capital, the returns received, the current valuation of my stake based on the business's growth, and the terms under which my stake could be bought out or transferred. She sent it to my father's existing business attorney with a cover note explaining that it was a routine formalization that any investor would want after several years of growth. My father called me the day after receiving it. He sounded confused and a little worried. He said, "Hazel, what is this about?" I said, "Dad, it's just a paperwork update. The business has grown. Any investor would want the documentation to reflect that." He said, "Your sister thinks it feels like a legal threat." I said, "My sister manages client relationships, not investor agreements." "This is between us, Dad." He went quiet. I kept my voice completely calm. I said, "I love you and I'm proud of what you've built. This is me protecting both of us." He said okay, and he said he would talk to his attorney. It took 3 weeks to finalize the updated agreement. My father signed it. I do not know what conversations he had with Renee in those 3 weeks. I can guess, but he signed it. While the agreement was being finalized, I asked Patricia to also prepare a formal notice regarding the expensed personal items. Not an accusation, not a lawsuit threat. Just a formal letter noting that certain categorized business expenses appeared to lack documented business purpose, and that as an investor I was requesting a reconciliation and reimbursement where appropriate. This letter went to my father, not to Renee, because legally Renee was an employee. The responsibility sat with the business owner. My father called me again after receiving that letter. This time he sounded less confused and more upset. He said Renee was very hurt. I said I understood that. But I said, "Dad, the expenses are real and they need to be addressed." He said she had not meant any harm. I said I was not discussing her intentions, I was discussing the documentation. He went quiet again. That letter resulted in a reimbursement of approximately $11,000 over the following 2 months. Broken into payments, which told me that Renee was handling it out of her own pocket, which told me that the amount was meaningful to her. I did not say anything about this to anyone. Not to my parents' friends, not to mutual acquaintances, not to anyone in the extended family. I just received the payments and filed them and moved on, but Renee knew. and her knowing changed something. The warmth she had always performed toward me, never genuine, I understand that now, but at least present, disappeared. She stopped reaching out. She stopped texting. She stopped the small social niceties that had filled the surface of our relationship for years. At first, my mother called me and said she was worried that Renee and I had had a fight. I told my mother we had not had a fight. She called back a week later and said Renee felt like I was treating her like an enemy. I said I had not spoken to Renee in several weeks. My mother said she knew, and that was the problem. I understand what my mother was doing in those phone calls. She was managing the family's emotional temperature the way she always had, which was to put pressure on the person most likely to quietly absorb. That person had always been me. I absorbed things. I let things go. I did not make scenes. I adjusted and moved on and kept the peace because keeping the peace felt like love. But I was done absorbing things. I told my mother very gently that if Renee had something to say to me, she was welcome to call me directly. My mother said she thought I was being cold. I said I thought I was being clear. She did not like that answer, but she did not push further because she could hear something in my voice that was new. I want to explain what that something was. It was not coldness, and it was not cruelty. It was the absence of apology. For the first time in my adult life, I was not apologizing for having expectations or for holding people to them. It is a strange feeling when you first find it. It feels unfamiliar and a little uncomfortable, like standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged. But underneath the discomfort is something solid, something you did not know was missing until it arrived. 2 months after the reimbursement was complete, the outside offer on the business came back. A revised offer, higher than the first, from the same firm. This time my father told me. I believe he told me because the formalized investor agreement made it legally necessary for him to consult me before any ownership transfer. Patricia had built that protection into the document. We had a meeting. Me, my father, Patricia, and my father's attorney. Renee was not in that meeting. I could feel that decision radiating outward long before I understood all of its consequences. The offer itself was interesting. The acquiring firm was legitimate, and the terms were not bad. But the structure they had proposed gave the current operators, meaning the management team, meaning Renee, a significant role in the post-acquisition company with equity tied to performance over 3 years. My stake as an original investor was acknowledged but minimized in a way that would have made my return on a decade of patient investment relatively modest. Patricia went through the offer line by line. Then she went through what a fair offer would look like given the documented growth of my investment. Then she made a counter-proposal. The counter-proposal did not reject the acquisition. It just recalibrated the return structure to reflect my actual position as an investor and removed certain provisions that were designed to concentrate equity in the management layer at my expense. The acquiring firm came back within a week. They accepted the revised terms almost entirely because the revised terms were fair and they knew it. The original terms had been favorable to management because management had been the one negotiating with them directly, without my knowledge or participation. Once I was in the room, the math changed. My father was quiet during most of that process. I think he was processing things he had not fully seen before. I think he was realizing that the story Renee had been telling him about the business, about her role, about my role, was a version of reality that had been shaped in her favor. Renee found out about the counter-proposal through my father. I was not in the room when he told her, but I received a text message from her that same evening that was the first direct communication she had sent me in almost 3 months. The message said, "I cannot believe you did this. Everything I built is being taken apart because of you." I read that message 3 times, and then I put my phone down and I did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I had learned, by this point, that silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is the most complete and accurate response available. Every word I wrote back would have given her something to argue with, something to twist, something to perform outrage about in front of our parents or her husband or anyone else she was building her case for. My silence gave her nothing. She sent 2 more messages that evening. One was longer and more emotional, talking about how much she had given to the business and how I had never been present the way she had, and how it was easy to be the investor from a distance, but that she had been there every day. The second was shorter and angrier and said some things I will not repeat here because they are not worth carrying. I read both messages. I did not respond to either. The next morning I got a call from my mother. Renee had called her crying the night before. My mother asked me to please just talk to Renee and let her know I still supported her. I asked my mother what Renee thought I should say. My mother said just tell her you're not trying to hurt her. I said, "Mom, I have not said a single unkind word to Renee in this entire process. Everything I have done has been legal and documented and fair." My mother said she knew that, but feelings were feelings. I said I understood that feelings were real. But I also said that I was no longer responsible or managing the feelings that resulted from other people's choices. That sentence changed the temperature of the call significantly. My mother said she felt like she did not know who I was lately. I said I understood how it might feel that way. And I said I loved her. And I meant it. And I ended the call. Here is the part of the story that the people who were treating me as the problem had not yet factored in. The acquiring firm's transaction was moving toward completion. The revised terms Patricia had negotiated meant my return on a decade of patient investment was going to be meaningful. Not life-changing in a dramatic way, but significant. A proper recognition of what had been built. But the part they had truly not factored in was this. The company where Renee held her director position, her title, her salary, her equity participation, her expensed car, her sense of identity, that company existed because of capital I had provided. The acquisition restructuring meant the new ownership's evaluation of retained staff would be conducted independently. They were not obligated to retain the existing management layer at the same compensation structure. That was a standard part of any acquisition process. Renee's equity participation under the original offer terms, the terms that had been quietly structured to benefit her, had been renegotiated. The new terms were fair to the business and to its investors, but they were not the golden outcome she had apparently been expecting. I did not design any of this to hurt her. I designed it to be fair. But fair was not what she had been expecting. She had been expecting the outcome of a game she thought she was the only one playing. My father called me about 2 weeks before the acquisition closed. He asked if we could have dinner together, just the two of us. I said yes. We went to a quiet restaurant near his office, and we ordered food, and we sat together the way we used to when I was younger, and he was teaching me to think carefully about things. He said he owed me an apology. I had not expected him to say that. I did not respond immediately. He said he had allowed things to happen in the business that he should not have allowed. He said he had let Renee manage things she was not equipped to manage fairly, and he had not paid enough attention to the effect that was having on me. He said the anniversary party had been weighing on him. He said he had not seen me fall, but someone had described it to him afterward, including that Renee had laughed, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it. I looked at my father across the table and I felt something complicated. Tenderness, old frustration, love. The grief of understanding that a parent can love you fully and still fail you in ways that leave marks. I did not want to perform anger at him. I also did not want to minimize what he was acknowledging. I said, "Dad, I need you to understand that the business decisions I made were not about punishing anyone. They were about protecting what I built." He nodded. I said, "But I also need you to understand that the anniversary party is not something I'm going to be able to just let go. Not because I want to hold it against Renee forever, but because I need you to have seen it, clearly, and to understand that a 30-second moment can show you a truth that 100 polite conversations can hide." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he understood. We had dinner and we talked about other things, and when I left I hugged him at the car, and it was a real hug, not a performed one. The acquisition closed on a Thursday. I was not at the office when it happened. I received a confirmation from Patricia, and I sat quietly with it for a few minutes, and then I went back to work. The fallout came in pieces. Renee's position was restructured in the new organization. She retained a role, but at a different level and different compensation than she had held before. Her title changed. The expensed vehicle arrangement ended because the new owners had a clear policy on company expenses and what qualified. I heard all of this through my father, not through any direct conversation with Renee. My mother called me to tell me Renee was devastated. I listened. I said I was sorry she was going through a hard time. My mother said she thought I should reach out. I said I would reach out when I felt ready to do so genuinely, not as a performance of kindness. My mother was quiet. Then she said, "You've become hard." I said, "No, Mom, I've become honest. That's different." About a month after the acquisition closed, Marcus, Renee's husband, contacted me directly. He sent a message through a professional platform which told me he had thought about how to reach me in a way that would not be easy to ignore. He said he wanted to talk. He said Renee was struggling. He said he thought there might have been some misunderstandings on both sides. He used that word, misunderstandings. I read that message and thought about what a misunderstanding was. A misunderstanding is when something was not clear, when the intent was good but the communication was poor, when two people had different information and drew different conclusions. A misunderstanding can be resolved with a conversation. What had happened between me and Renee was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A consistent pattern of treating me like a resource rather than a person, of building a professional identity on a foundation I had provided without acknowledgement, of laughing while I was on the ground. I replied to Marcus. I told him I appreciated him reaching out and that I did not hold anything against him personally. I told him I was not available for a conversation about what had happened from a business perspective because those matters were concluded. I told him that if Renee and I were going to rebuild a relationship, it would need to begin with her reaching out to me directly. Not through our mother. Not through him, her, directly. He did not reply. Renee did not contact me directly for another 6 weeks. When she finally did, it was a voice message. I have listened to it more than once. Her voice was tired in a way I had not heard before. She said she wanted to talk. She said she knew things had not been right between us for a long time and that she had not always treated me the way she should have. She did not say she was sorry, not directly, not in the voice message. But she said she missed me. And she said she hoped we could find a way back. I sat with that voice message for 2 days. I thought about everything that had happened. From the first moment I had seen that salary figure in the folder on my parents' dining table to the acquisition closing to the dinner with my father to the silence that had followed. I thought about the anniversary party and the fall and the laugh. And I called her back. Not because everything was forgiven, not because I had decided that none of it mattered, but because I had decided that I was not going to let the worst chapter of a relationship define its entire future. Because I loved my sister, somewhere under everything. Not the relationship we had been performing for years, but the possibility of something real. When she answered the phone, I could hear her exhale, like she had not known until that moment whether I would call. I said, "I'm calling because I got your message and I want to talk. But I need you to know that what comes next is different. I'm not available for the version of this where I absorb things quietly and you don't notice." She said she understood. I said I needed to actually believe that before I could trust it. She said she understood that too. We talked for almost 2 hours. It was not comfortable and it was not resolved in one conversation. But it was honest in a way that conversations between us had not been for years. Maybe never. She told me things I had not known. She told me that for most of her adult life, she had felt like she was living in the shadow of someone who did everything right, and that the resentment of that had become something she had not fully understood or controlled. She told me that what she had done in the business had started small and then kept going because no one stopped it. She told me that the laugh at the party, she went still when she mentioned it. She said, "I know that was cruel. I don't have a good explanation for it. I just know it happened and I can't undo it. And I'm sorry." That apology landed differently than I expected. Not as a relief exactly, more like a door opening. I told her things too. I told her that I had spent years managing everyone's comfort at the cost of my own. I told her that being called the responsible one had felt like love when I was young and had started to feel like a sentence somewhere along the way. I told her I was done being the person who always stayed calm so everyone else could afford to fall apart. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "I think I knew that about you and I took advantage of it." I said, "Yes, you did." She said, "I'm sorry, Hazel." I said, "I know. That was not the end. It was the beginning of something new, which is harder and slower and less satisfying than an ending but more real. My father's business is now part of a larger organization. He has a role there that suits him, a kind of senior advisor function that keeps him involved without the full weight of ownership. He seems lighter. I think the years of managing the business while Renee gradually took it over had been more exhausting than he admitted. Now he gardens. He calls me on Sunday mornings. We talk about things that have nothing to do with money. My mother and I are working on it. She is a person who reads love as smoothness, as the absence of conflict, as everyone smiling at the same time in the same room. I am no longer able to give her that version of things without cost. But I can give her honesty, and I can give her consistency, and I can give her a version of our relationship that does not require me to disappear into it. She is adjusting, slowly, but she is adjusting. Renee and I are not close the way sisters on television are close, but we are honest. She no longer calls me only when she needs something. I no longer absorb things silently and then smile over them. When something is wrong, we say so. That is not nothing. That is actually a great deal. And I am still working, still building, still quiet about it in the way that is simply my nature, not a hiding strategy. The number in my accounts has nothing to do with how I feel about my days. I work because the work is interesting. I invest because I am good at seeing what other people miss. I live the way I have always lived, which is carefully and attentively and without much noise. I want to leave you with one thought before the end. The moment that changed everything was not a legal document or a counter-proposal or a formal letter or a business acquisition. The moment that changed everything was 30 seconds of sitting on a stone patio floor looking up at a person who was laughing while I was in pain. That was the moment my body understood something my mind had been carefully explaining away for years. You can love people. You can want good things for them. You can fund their businesses and swallow your grievances and show up to their parties and carry water glasses across patios. And all of that love can be entirely real. But it cannot exist in a vacuum. It cannot survive indefinitely in a relationship where it only moves in one direction. The question is never whether you love the people who are hurting you. Of course you do. That is the whole reason it hurts. The question is what you are going to do with the clarity that arrives when you finally stop explaining away what you already know. I stopped explaining it away. And everything that followed, the documents, the attorney,